Hi everyone. Today we're going to be speaking about what happened to the early Muslim community after the Prophet Muhammad died. We already talked a bit about his early life, about the initial moment of revelation when the Quran was received, and his early difficulties and how the community moved from Mecca to Medina. But now we're going to speak about briefly what happens after he reconquers Mecca, in which there's really just a few years before he dies. So remember, he went on the Hijrah from Mecca to Medina in 622, or year zero in the Muslim calendar. Then he, after a few years of battles, ends up reconquering Mecca, but then he dies in 632. So really, we're just looking at a few years here. After reconquering Mecca, he does an act of reconciliation. So he appoints some of his former enemies, people like Abu Sufyan and his sons, Muawiyah and Yazid. Now remember those names because they're important. They're going to be important people later on, and specifically their clan, subclan rather, of the Quraysh tribe. That subclan is called the Umayyah. Now he puts them in power, kind of integrates them, right? So he reconciles with his enemies. He takes on a few other different tribes in the areas. He fights another tribe called the Thaqif. He takes control of a city called Ta'if, which is basically between Mecca and Medina. And then turns now against the polytheists who he had previously kind of temporarily allied and cooperated with, now forcing them into the category of Muslim rather than, as we saw before, which is different from that of believer. He performs a final Hajj, he returns to Mecca, comes back to Medina, and he dies there in 632. So an eventful few years, but ultimately relatively quick after his great success. Now, the problem is, having now essentially established a community, created a new political space in Mecca, Medina, Taif, and a few other places, there wasn't any clear succession plan when he died. He didn't say anything. He didn't leave any instructions. The Quran didn't leave any guidance. As we can see, the Quran itself is basically a very spiritual work that we can read for certain cultural signs historically, but doesn't give us a lot of actual information or direction. And then after he died, basically there was a question of whether this community that he had built should remain as a single community. After all, it was composed of multiple different parts. But why should they now continue to function as a whole? And if we look at the early community at this point, there are a variety of different groups, right? We have what are called the Muhajirun, the immigrants from Mecca, the original kind of hardcore or initial followers of Muhammad who went with him from Mecca to Medina. Then there's the people who helped him, his supporters in Medina, the Ansar. Afterwards, there's people who joined him in various campaigns and different moments at that point. And finally, from there, we have the Quraysh from Mecca who joined him after he conquered Mecca and had converted again from polytheism to Islam. Following that, there's people from the towns of Taif and Khaybar. And then there's believers, kind of the broader world of Jews and Christians in Arabia at the time who had joined the believer movement, or at least were supporters of it. Now, should all those people be now fall under the same community? That was one central question. Now, out of that group, basically a specific section, the helpers, the supporters from Medina, the Ansar, selected a close follower of Muhammad, Abu Bakr, as the new leader of the community. Abu Bakr had been a very early convert and supporter of Muhammad. He had already been part of the group and was closely aligned. I think in many ways it was a unanimous choice, but there was also some dissension, and some people thought that the leadership of the community, though, should remain in the family of the Prophet Muhammad. Now, the Prophet Muhammad didn't have any sons. He only had one daughter, Fatima, and she was married to a man named Ali. Ali was the son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad. Now, some people argued that he should be the next leader of the community. But in the end, Abu Bakr seems to have gained the consensus. By the way, this is a 17th century painting from India depicting Abu Bakr and the Prophet Muhammad hiding in a cave from their enemies in Mecca. Now, what did it actually mean to be a leader of this new community of believers / Muslims in this period? First and foremost, we have to point out that this new leader is not a prophet, right? He does not continue to receive revelation. He doesn't speak for God. He does not have the same religious capacity in any way like that of the Prophet Muhammad. Okay, he is essentially a political leader. He's guiding the community, resolving its disputes, and deciding where and how they're going to expand. And specifically, we should look at the title that this person takes on. Abu Bakr took on the title of Amir al-Mu'minin. A mu'min is a believer. Amir is a military commander. So what he means is commander of the believers. Now, again, the point is, what is the main term that they used to refer to the early community here? Believers. Okay. Another point is to mention they did not use the word caliph. Caliph is a common term sometimes used to discuss early Islamic rulership, etc. That was a term that came later. Now at this point we just have one word, Amir al-Mu'minin, commander of the believers. Okay. Another thing you might find, a lot of you may go online to try to understand this material better, and you have this period called, these figures called the Rashidun, the successors after the Prophet Muhammad. That to refer to the first four successors, that is a term that is used, but again later on. But it also reflects a later consensus about political legitimacy. So I would recommend that you do not use it in the course of this class, okay? Now, quickly after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, as I pointed out, there was a lot of discussion as to what exactly were now the obligations of the various members of the community to the new leader and to the community itself. Were they actually tied to the Prophet Muhammad, or were they tied to something called Islam or the believer movement? And very quickly, actually, some of the nomadic tribes who had just had an alliance understood their agreements with Muhammad as just an alliance with Muhammad himself after the capture of Mecca. They refused to be part of it anymore. They said, well, we're not going to pay you taxes. We're not going to pay tribute, etc. This isn't our purpose. And this was, I think, the first challenge. Abu Bakr had to deal with these tribes who turned away from the new community. In Arabic, this is called the ridda, turning away. It takes on a larger term of apostasy, because not only are they politically turning away from the community, but they're also turning their backs on the fact that they had joined this new believer movement, right? So these are seen as moments of apostasy as well. So he basically waged war on these recalcitrant tribes who had reneged on their contract or understood their relationships with the believer community in a different way. And I think it's important to see that Abu Bakr's, let's say, nickname, as you were, was Al-Siddiq. Now, Siddiq can mean two things. Sadaqa means truth. Siddiq can mean the person who speaks the truth, the truthful one. But Sadaqa also means, that same root can also mean taxes. And so the Siddiq is also someone who forces you to pay taxes, right? So what he is doing in many ways is forcing these people to pay their taxes as part of this new community. Now, these tribes themselves didn't just rebel politically, but they also saw the power of this new idea of having a prophet, of having a scripture, of having revelation. And in fact, many of them also began as part of their kind of rebellion to put forth the idea that they also had prophets or prophetesses. So in Yemen, down here, there was a figure named Aswad al-Ansi, who came to be a prophet in the Najd, the central desert region of what is now today Central Arabia. There's a tribe called the Asad who had a figure named Talha ibn Khuwaylid. There was a tribe of Tamim who had a prophetess named Sajah. The tribe of Hanifa over here, where it says Gambarin, it had a figure named Musaylama. Now, each of these, in a sense, were counter versions of the Prophet Muhammad and his revelation. But ultimately, as they were defeated by the new Muslim community, these groups were put back into the fold. Now, this created a sort of basically a three-tier system in the believer community. There is a core of the Prophet Muhammad's group, right? So the immigrants, the people that went from Mecca to Medina, the Muhajirun, the helpers from Medina, the Ansar, the Quraysh, the original tribe of the Prophet Muhammad who lived in Mecca, the people from the cities of Mecca, the kind of general non-nomadic people who lived in the cities. These were kind of group Team A, right? The first group, highest part. Then below that, there was nomadic people who basically stuck with the Muslim community, the believer community, in the Ridda Wars. These are mostly nomadic groups during the close to Medina. Second tier. And then there's the nomadic groups who decided to turn against or depart from the believer community at that time and were seen as apostates. So this include the Hanifa tribe, the Tamim tribe, Tayya, Kinda. And these tribes were seen as kind of the third tier. And in fact, in some tribes, like the entirety of the tribe of Hanifa, were technically enslaved and forced to work on large estates, etc., as a punishment. Now, what ends up happening after these Ridda Wars, which last for about 2 to 3 years, under basically the role of Abu Bakr. What it does is that now all of a sudden all of Arabia is now one political unit, right? Medina is at the center, that's the sort of capital, but all of this space, which is again very deserty and not particularly populated, but it is now one united political unit. Instead of having multiple tribes fighting and raiding each other at the same time, they are now all joined together with a sort of common purpose, and they cannot fight each other, right? This is one of the kind of core ideas of this, that a believer is not supposed to attack or harm another believer, etc. And instead of having competing tribal armies and fights, you had a sort of centralized, semi-permanent army dedicated to the believer cause. So this also created a push now, well, what to do with these people who are used to raiding, who are making a living off of raids, but now have to direct their energies elsewhere. And we'll see that kind of was one of the pushes, drivers of the expansion and conquest of other areas in the years afterwards. So let's quickly look at the leaders who came after the Prophet Muhammad. We'll get into more detail with them later, but we have essentially 4 figures. Again, don't call these people the Rashidun. That reflects a different theological consensus that wasn't around at that time. Abu Bakr didn't live that long. Basically, was around for 3 years. Died of an illness. But what I want to point out is that over the next essentially 27 years, we have 3 figures: Omar, Uthman, and Ali. Each of these men, as leaders of the Muslim community, are actually murdered. Omar, it's not clear why, but he was stabbed to death by his slave. Uthman was murdered by his disgruntled troops. And Ali was ultimately assassinated by a follower. And by this point, we have the first civil war of the Muslim community, of the believer community, in the kind of ensuing 30 years after, basically 30 years after the Prophet Muhammad's death. Now we'll get into that in future lessons. Bye.